Welcome and thank you for watching my presentation on using qualitative practices as applied to the assessment of organizational culture. We'll go through some background on how we began this journey and talk about the analysis approach that we used, how we decided what type of qualitative analysis we would do, and specifically focus on our photo coding efforts and what we got from those. We'll show you some examples and then discuss future application. So the big impetus behind doing this was there was an organizational change effort to increase the experience of students in STEM fields, and in particular here within the engineering department. The change effort focused on breaking down stovepipes and creating alignment of the education experience, specifically working towards an integrative and collaborative approach to both pedagogy and to student development, in order to produce a transformative and positive learning environment for students. And so by looking at this change effort and specifically looking at the organization's culture drove us to ask questions like, is the department able to adapt to these changes? Is it able to take on some of these different efforts? And how does the culture play into the way that the department responds to these? We already were doing some quantitative assessment and interviewing faculty within the department. So the opportunity to do photo coding represented some complementary analysis to what we are already doing. And the larger approach that we took, this integrative approach to qualitative analysis, just means that we were doing multiple types of qualitative analysis in this larger effort. So first off, we looked at, well, how are we going to assess organizational culture? And we decided to use the model proposed by Schein, which looks at culture as artifacts, norms, and assumptions. That is, what are some things that everybody kind of holds true about the culture? What are things that people are expected to do? And what are the artifacts being symbols that might represent these norms and assumptions? And this model's fairly widely known and used already, and it lends itself well to qualitative analysis because of the observation of these things like artifacts and assumptions. Additionally, there is this article by Chatman and O'Reilly in 2016 that proposed using the Schein model as a common way forward for organizational culture research in driving both assessment and the way we think about culture. And their model proposed this use of intensity scores, which tries to give a value to things like norms, in this case, based on the usage or how widely held certain beliefs are. And their paper used norms as the example of modeling this. We are, in this project, using artifacts as a way of modeling that. And so, again, this integrative approach just meant that we were applying coding and this new intensity scoring method and comparing different sources, meaning we were matching what we were doing with photo coding of artifacts to the coding of the interviews that we did. And so, as I mentioned here, both the interviews and the photos, the interviews were based on, we were able to gather common themes of the language that's used to represent the department. So those are representing the norms of the department, while the photos will represent the artifacts. So this is just the reminder that we began with the interview coding and then moved on to the photo coding. The interview codes allowed us to go through the process of recognizing what people said about the department to gather the norm and assumption data and build some common themes based on theory related to organizational culture, and then create aggregate dimensions. But what we want to focus on is the photo coding piece and how we did that. So as you can see in the right-hand corner, this figure, this photo, is actually from the Rainsmith 2012 article. And this represents an approach to doing content analysis with photos. And they point out how one can identify the important contextual components of a space just through what's represented in a photo. So we applied this same technique through the photos that we had of the office spaces in this department and looked at what are the artifacts that we can identify that we think are related to or symbolic of the norms and assumptions specifically for the culture of this department. And so we reviewed photos of 31 different office spaces and actually came up with 765 different artifacts, or descriptions of artifacts, I should say, for these office spaces by applying this specific content analysis. And what this allowed us to do was compare the culture coding experience of the photos with that of the interview codes. And so this just kind of reminder of what we did was taking the initial codes that were based on the faculty interviews, and we had those codes again, which represented the general themes that we thought were norms and assumptions of the culture of the department. We based this on both the organizational change effort and on organizational culture theory. And then we looked at the artifacts in the office photos, and we're looking for what are the organizational culture implications of those potential artifacts and how they might be related to the norms and assumptions that we are finding from the interview data. And these photos are actually of offices that we have on campus, not though of the data that we collected. It's just to maintain the data integrity. So to walk you through the photo coding approach that we took, the first thing that we did was looking at artifacts, which the definition here is symbols which reflect norms and assumptions. So again, kind of seeing they're something that exists, but they're reflective of other things that we can observe or learn about that are espoused by the actual people in the department. And so the artifact itself in this case would be something like a desk or a personal item, or a window, office furniture, something else that we could observe and see. And then the description of the item is the first order code. So in this example, the desk is the artifact, and then the first order code would be a description of its size, quality, setup, or what kind of clutter or how it's being used per se. And so one artifact may have many first order codes. The next step was to then match these to the codes that we had from the interview data. And so you can see the process that we went through here. We were asking questions about how the artifact was used or why it's important. What are the implications to the organizational culture theory that we're applying? And most importantly, what we wanted to know was, do the interview codes actually apply to what we're seeing? This was important because we wanted artifact codes or the observations of artifacts to be similar to what we were getting from interviews so that we could show that artifacts truly were a representation of the norms and assumptions. And what we found was that largely they did. They matched up to the codes that we had gotten from the interview data. And so you can see again, the desk example, the desk is the artifact. Underneath those are the multiple descriptions, the first order codes, if you will. And then the next set of codes were from the interview coding. And so again, these represent norms and assumptions. And you can see how they matched on. So built-in, the description of a desk, the built-ins of a desk, if you go to the right, those are based on resource implications. Going back under desk, you have standing desk. And if you work your way to the right, the work style is one of the larger level norm or assumption codes that matches onto that. And then we continued to build from there. So the next step was applying intensity scores. And again, this was based on how important something seemed, how it was used, and whether it drove some level of uniqueness or distraction within the office space. So we scored them from 1 to 5, low to high, with a lot of things being averaged, because in your typical office, there's a lot of just average things in there. So your standard desk would just be average. If it was a standing desk or a fancy desk, it'd be a little bit higher because of a dynamic workspace. Things that were really fancy or colorful or a lot of clutter, that's where we get into a high score, a 5 intensity score, just because it was distracting or there was a lack of focus because of it. Also, some office spaces were shared. So if somebody had a non-shared office space, we rated that as low intensity, just to represent the fact that they didn't have to deal with having a shared office space. And then finally, what we did was we combined the artifacts, or we created a root and branch kind of framework to display artifact categories. So starting with the indicator itself to the themes that we were seeing, and then finally to that larger second order code that was shared with the interview codes. And this allowed us to compare the relationships between different artifacts and how they end up representing different themes. This is especially useful for working backwards from the highest order code down to specific artifacts to see what kind of commonalities exist. So, for instance, individualism always related to personal items, and politics was always related to office settings. So, this helped us to identify what kind of patterns were emerging. So, to give you an idea of how all of this kind of came together, got some examples from those office photos. In this first one, you can see a relatively clean office, though it is a shared space. And the bottom left here has an example of how we put a full code together. So the artifact itself, in this case, is the office setting. It's a shared space, which gave it a high intensity score. And the theme of an office setting was almost always based on politics or resource implications. And then throughout, you can kind of see other things that we noticed. So we would always look at, say, windows, whether or not they had them, what they faced. We looked at shelving and storage, personal items, how the desks were set up, how the floor space was used, whether or not it was set up for things like collaboration or other instances like that. Now, this office is an example of a more cluttered space, and you can see from the coding example in the bottom left that again, the artifact is the office setting itself, but the description we're focusing on here is the clutter, which gave it a high intensity score. But the theme overall is now based on work style. So that's just one example of one of the artifacts that came out of this office. But as you can see, there are also many different possible artifacts that we could look at in this office space, as well as multiple descriptions for each artifact to identify what is actually going on in this space and how to identify how it's being used, how important these things are, and how they might be representative of the culture. And so really the big takeaway from all of this is the ability to use photos and how to identify artifacts in photos of something like an office space. And in the example of our research here, the resulting combination of cultural artifacts and themes complement the overall culture assessment of the department. And they demonstrate how individuals in their offices may contribute to or perpetuate organizational culture just through their office settings or their workspace. And so artifacts really help us tell this visual story, which we've captured in the photos here. And by combining with other culture assessment, we get a more rich overview of what the bigger culture picture is. Now, importantly, here is this piece on the contextual snapshot and identifying specifically at what point in time these photos are being used and where these artifacts might fit in, just because, especially in like a university setting, they might not be in session in summer, so these offices might be hardly used in the summertime, versus if you see it like in the middle of a semester when they're very busy. Or it could be a situation right now where with a global pandemic, no one's in their office. So could really change just depending on that context. And you want to make sure you capture that when you get the photo. So for future application, I think this has a lot of promise using photo coding in the future to do content analysis, to identify artifacts, especially in something like an office setting. And I do believe that the codes that we came up with could potentially be common codes for identifying cultural components in office settings. And I also think that this use of intensity scoring is especially useful in that it gives you an idea of what is important in that setting and how are the artifacts being used. And this adds to the overall Schein model itself. I think in the future also it would be helpful to get multiple time points or snapshots of the context as it's being used. That's all for my presentation. Thank you for watching.